Hi, CMB students. My name is Selma Masri. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Chemistry at UC Irvine. And my lab is interested in defining the molecular mechanisms underlying how disruption of the circadian clock is implicated in cancer. So what is the circadian clock? This is our genetically encoded internal biological pacemaker. It dictates rhythms within 24-hour periods. And so what are some examples of things that are regulated by the clock? Your sleep-wake cycle, feeding fasting rhythms, immune regulation, so immune system, metabolic rhythms, as well as endocrine rhythms. All of these pathways are actually controlled by our internal biological pacemaker. So this circadian clock is responsible in our body for dictating normal physiology and homeostasis. My lab's interested in defining what happens when the circadian clock is disrupted. So when you disrupt the clock, we know that from the field and several studies from our lab and others, that actually disruption of the clock accelerates tumor formation. We're interested in looking at how the clock does that in terms of immune regulation, metabolic dysfunction, as well as changes of cell cycle and proliferative cues. So we're interested in actually several cancer types. In the lab, we work with lung cancer as well as colorectal cancer. And today I'm going to tell you just a little bit about our interest in colorectal cancer and what we do. So colorectal cancer is a very interesting disease. So this is data projected to the year 2030. And these are the incidence rates of colorectal cancer in adults, either 50 and older or 75 and older. And you can see that the incidence of colorectal cancer in these adults is on the decline, so it's decreasing. However, in young adults, especially those in the age range of in their 20s and 30s, you see that the incidence of colorectal cancer is on an increase. And there's a very sad example recently. A very talented actor, which I'm sure many of you are aware, Chadwick Boseman, recently passed away. He was diagnosed with colorectal cancer at the age of 39 and died within 4 years of his diagnosis. So why do we think that colorectal cancer is implicated in circadian rhythms? We think actually that disruption of the circadian clock is one of the underlying features that's involved in acceleration of young onset colorectal cancer and many young onset diseases. And why is that? Young adults are up later at night. They have increased light at night exposure. The types of diet that they're eating and when they're eating that food actually could be very different from older adults. And so we're very interested in defining the environmental factors as well as the genetic factors underlying young onset disease. So we study colorectal cancer in my lab using both in vivo genetically engineered mouse models, as well as in vitro and ex vivo approaches. This is an example of one of our ex vivo models. We use an intestinal organoid system. And so an organoid culture is essentially a culture that is a 3D culture. It's a mini gut culture that we culture in a matrix that allows us to study the growth properties of these cells. So this is what the intestinal epithelium looks like. These are villi, and this is a crypt base. And within the crypt, you can see actually these green cells here are stem cells. These stem cells give rise to these organoid cultures. And these are images taken from my lab. You can see that these are what normal intestinal organoids look like. And this is, again, a stem cell-based model. And this is confocal microscopy of those organoids. When we disrupt the circadian clock, you actually see that the normal morphology of these organoids is disrupted. They become highly proliferative and tumorigenic. And so these are basically tumor spheres, intestinal tumor spheroids. And so these organoid cultures, basically, we can study their properties, look at many of the factors, the signaling factors, metabolic cues, immune interaction within the tumor microenvironment, and basically define exactly how disruption of the clock accelerates tumor formation in the intestine. As I mentioned, we study both models of lung cancer as well as colorectal cancer. We're also interested in expanding into new cancer subtypes. And so I'd be happy to talk to anyone if they're interested in this. I'm just going to briefly summarize some of the ongoing projects in my lab. We're recruiting graduate students, so if you're interested in joining our group, please feel free to reach out. As I mentioned, we work with genetically engineered systems, mouse models. We're also interested in environmental disruption of the circadian clock by changing food and light regulation. We're also very interested in how disruption of the clock is involved in disruption of the immune system and looking at how circadian disruption is involved in the tumor microenvironment. We do a lot of intestinal organoid work. We do a lot of intestinal stem cell biology and how this is related to circadian disruption. We're very interested in the microbiome and looking how clock disruption impacts the gut microbiome, the gut flora. To study all of these things, we use molecular techniques, cell biology-based techniques, and we heavily rely on omics approaches, looking at RNA sequencing, DNA sequencing to look at mutagenic spectrum, as well as metabolomics approaches to study metabolite-based interactions. So this is my group. We have several postdocs in my lab, a graduate student, lab technician, and undergraduates. This is my contact information shown here. This is my email address. If you're interested, please feel free to reach out. There is much more information on my lab website, so please visit masrilaboratory.com, and you'll be able to understand more about the projects that we're running, publications from the lab, and various aspects about the various people in my group and what they're interested in, what they're doing. Of course, this would not be possible without funding, and this is just a snapshot of some of our funding sources in the lab. And so as I mentioned, we are recruiting graduate students. Please come and join us. We're in a very young, energetic lab, and we're very interested in working with you. So if you're interested in cancer biology, stem cell biology, immune regulation, microbiome, and how that potentially could be implicated in circadian rhythms, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to chat with you about the ongoing work in my lab. Thank you so much.